We got Frank, we got Jori, I'm Fitz. We're all back together, the dream team. Jori got last week off for C-Rob. Now she's back in. Frank, so far the episode has started without anyone seeing it with a very uncoordinated clap that took 2 or 3 times. If you don't know, usually somebody claps, we count 3, 2, 1, and then there's a clap, and that's their way of making sure the audio is synced up. Frank, I always heard bad rehearsal made great show. So the fact that our clap started off a little wary before anyone tuned in be an indication that maybe we have an issue today? Or does it mean we're about to have the best show of our lives?
We need to get the Jori 1 through 10 measure again to see what kind of show this will be. I just want to get out of this show without making another dumb bet with Fitz, which I sometimes rope myself into with stupid things I say. But we'll see how the next hour goes. It's possible I could lose another C-note to Fitz with something dumb I say. It's possible.
Okay, yeah, I texted you guys after last week's show. I was like, I didn't know we're betting now. And they're like, what do you mean? We've always been betting. I'm like, okay, but publicly on these shows like that, we hadn't done that in a bit.
Well, for the record,
he knows my weak spot. That's all I say. That's all I'll say.
Your weak spot. I mean, Frank and I think we became kindred spirits. Frank Schwab, by the way, Jori Epstein, I'm Jason Fitz. Frank and I became kindred spirits the first time we actually did a show together at the Venetian, when we realized that both of us are degenerates. That's going to happen. But I really blame C-Rob for the $100 bet because it started off very classy, Jori. Like, it was just going to be 2 guys going out to dinner. And then C-Rob pointed out that we would just expense it to Yahoo, which, by the way, I never would have thought of. I would have used my own cash. So C-Rob instead decided it must be a cash payout. So, Jori, this is indirectly all Charles Robinson's fault, which means you have a lot of stirring to do to hold up to what Charles did last week.
Wow. Okay, I'll see what I can stir up. We've got some options here.
Okay, I appreciate that. All right, so we're going to do something fun today with some expectations because, frankly, there's been a lot of chatter about a certain number of teams, players, coaches, all these different things. I want to measure some of the expectations that are way out of whack, whether they're too high or too low. We're going to do all of that. But before we do it, we do have some news, and I think it's kind of significant because according to the NFL Network's Tom Pelissero, the NFLPA is pushing to end OTAs and have a ramp-up period leading into training camp instead. Now, I want to point out that when we were covering the draft for Yahoo, Charles Robinson went in on this and was very clear from that point that the NFLPA wanted more time off. And so the first time I heard this report, Jori, all I kept thinking is this is all part of the pre-negotiation that it feels like to me from a distance is happening as we prepare for the battle to 18 games.
The battle to 18 games. That's a great name. Yeah, I think that this is definitely something that's interesting for a lot of people in the NFLPA. Their argument is if you look at other leagues, they have training camp equivalents that are a longer ramp up, a more gradual physical ramp up, but they're all at one time, which I've talked to people in the PA about this, and they say, look, like, how many guys actually remember what you install in OTAs 6 weeks later? If you get there, you're restarting from OTA 1. Like, you are restarting everything you learned with the playbook when you get back to training camp. Yeah, it's the second time you've drilled it, but the way that people remember things is via repetition and via creating these associations, and having 6 weeks off right after you learned it isn't the best way. They'll also say physically, like, the impacts of what you physically do in April and May, the NFLPA believes does not carry over to September and October. There's definitely a lot of talk this week about guys wanting to have family vacations with their kids in the summer. I mean, you can say you get more time off if you don't have OTAs, but you don't get more time off when your kids are out of school. So that is definitely a tricky part. And I think for me, what this comes down to is, what is the NFLPA's goal here? Because there's the idea of just like a constant, steady stream of leverage. And I do believe that the NFLPA showed a little bit of a strong arm with the report cards and with this almost like public shaming of owners who weren't up to the task in certain areas of the way they treated their players. But if you're telling me that the 18th game, which is probably going to be the most leverage the NFLPA has had in a non-CBA year, if not including in a CBA year, in a very long time, I guess including the 17th game, because the owners need this. They need this for revenue. They need this for their broadcast partners. They need this for their plans for international expansion. Like, you have leverage as players that you do not usually have. And I hope they will not only use that on off-season activities that are not the most important part of what they could be bargaining for.
I think the players love this idea. Of course, why wouldn't they? The owners are like, well, we don't make any money off OTAs, so of course we're going to give that up for an 18th game. You know, the group that's going to hate this is coaches. Like, if coaches had 120 hours of practice time in a week, they'd be like, oh my God, I need 125. Like, they just are maniacal about practice time. And even in its OTAs, it's May or it's shorts, doesn't matter. They care so much about every single ounce of practice time they can get with these guys that they're going to push back. I don't know that that's strong enough because, again, players are good with it. NFL will be good with it. Again, they make no money off OTAs. Most fans don't even really understand OTAs. I overheard somebody talking today about OTAs, and I had to stop myself from chiming in like, no, that's really not how it is. So the only people who are going to really hate this are coaches, and you are going to hear a lot of complaining from coaches. But ultimately, I don't think they got the power to stop it. So I assume we're going to see a pretty radical change to the OTAs some point soon. And then in return, we'll get the 18th game.
Okay, so I know I like playing the part of an idiot here, but for a minute, I'm going to be kind of smart, okay? Because I took this morning, and I know it's just dangerous. I talked to Marshall Newhouse this morning, and then that led me down the rabbit hole of talking to 5 former players, all asking them the same things. Now, I want to qualify that I've been a part of unions before, the Musicians Union, SAG-AFTRA, they're all unions. So I understand the trouble with collective bargaining. Here's what's interesting about this entire process to me. Realistically, while this helps some players, it hurts others. And that's always going to be one of the things that is really hard for the NFLPA. Think about it. Marshall pointed out quickly that when you're a young player, you need that spring install because you need as much time as you can get with it. Plus, you need to figure out whose hip you're going to get in so you can learn how to be a professional. He pointed out being 21 coming into the league, he thought he was mature, but there's a difference. All of a sudden, you're trying to figure out who can you start talking to? Who can you take advice from? If everybody is away from the facility, the fringe guys that are trying to figure out a way to make it into the league are going to have a tougher road. If they push all of this back closer to training camp, undrafted free agents and guys that are sort of bouncing, they'll have a tougher road. So if you try and solve it by allowing young players to still have the OTA opportunity, then you're actually hurting your middle-class veteran players that are not going to be around the coaches while the young players are. So the coaches are going to get an affinity for these young guys, which means you're going to replacing churn and burn the entire middle class. One of the things that will always be difficult for the NFLPA is that, frankly, they represent thousands of players. And unlike most unions, those thousands of players all have very different objectives. Some of them will play for a long time. Some of them will barely play. Some of them are worried about just getting on a roster, and some of them are worried about protecting their body. And I think it's interesting. One former player I talked to today at length said, look, early in my career, I needed these OTAs. Late in my career, I didn't want anything to do with them. So he lived through both sides of it. And the difficulty the NFLPA will always have when they negotiate with the owners is that 32 owners want one thing. They all know what they want, and they're on one common page about how to get it. The NFLPA is thousands of people that want different things. So it's interesting to me that even this very innocent, let's just get rid of OTAs and push everything back, has an ancillary effect, Jori, that could harm a lot of different people that are in different spots in this league. There is no one easy answer.
Right. And I do think you make a great point that guys who aren't familiar with the playbook, either because they're new to the league or because they're new to this team, they arrive via free agency, trade, etc., like to not have the ability to study the playbook. Like so many guys are off working with a private trainer, especially the quarterbacks and running backs, like all these different people on the drills. And I know that like if you're a quarterback or receiver and you're working with these private coaches, you're bringing them their playbook, you're bringing them what you did in OTAs and saying like, hey, let me run through this. Let me have as many reps as it as possible. And so you really have this issue. Another thing is I know when I covered the Cowboys, head coach Mike McCarthy would often talk about how one of the big goals of the spring is to get the rookies and veterans on the same page because they're coming from such different backgrounds. And until they're on the same page, the team isn't going to function cohesively like the goal. Well, like you're saying, if the veterans aren't in the building, does that matter? I don't fundamentally believe most players need OTAs and mini camp as like the be all end all. That's why I think, first of all, like I'm still surprised this is as much of a conversation as it is. I shouldn't be because everything with the NFL is, but when this news dropped, I'm like, do people care that much about off-season practices? Like you were talking about fans and whether they know OTAs. Like I remember I did a story with a rookie recently, probably in the last few years. This was a drafted player at a prominent position. I'll leave it at that. And they didn't know the difference between training camp and OTAs. They thought they were going to training camp in May because even though this is obvious to us because we've been around in the NFL, like guys watch football on Sundays, or fans, I should say, watch football on Sundays. They're not watching football practices in May. And so you really do have some of this catch up that needs to be done. And I think the question is the same way that it doesn't seem to hurt players when they're holding out from contracts and not going to OTAs. Would it hurt players if the OTAs didn't exist at all?
I mean, maybe. I hear that, but let me ask you this quickly, Frank, because I know we have expectations. To speaking of people that are worried about things. Should we worry, for example, that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins aren't at OTAs for the Bengals? Is there no consequence to that at all? I mean, it's a fair question.
It is. But it kind of, let's weave it all together into saying the NFL wouldn't have this problem, if it's a problem at all, if the word voluntary was actually followed. T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are holding out of stuff that they don't have to be at, technically. But the entire league knows it is not voluntary. It is not. Everybody gets shamed when they're not there. Everybody, basically, you have to show up because it is quote unquote voluntary. If the NFL actually stuck by the voluntary thing, it could help the undrafted free agents. It could help the guys who were just traded to a new team, the guys Jori was just talking about. But since the NFL has to be the NFL, voluntary is not really voluntary. You're going to get shamed out of the league if you don't show up. So when you ask, like, is it a big deal? But, T. Higgins and all this kind of stuff, it's really not. Like, it shouldn't be. These guys, Justin Jefferson's going to show up. If he showed up September 9th or whenever their opener is, he'd be just fine. He's Justin Jefferson. But since we have this whole mentality that these guys have to show up to voluntary events, it becomes a bigger deal than it is. And that is why we're in this whole mess with the 18th game and giving up OTAs and all this kind of stuff.
I mean, human nature is what human nature is, to Joy. I'll just say this quickly. Like, if you're around the coaches all the time, voluntary or not, if you're around coaches all the time, you're going to create bonds with coaches. Like, you want to give yourself the best shot, even if it's voluntary for guys that are trying to get in. Being around those things makes sense for that very human nature element of it, Joy.
Yeah, I think I will also ask you guys, do you believe that if guys don't show up until July and so they're then off, let's say early January to early July rather than coming back in April, how different do you think the fitness levels that they have in July and August will be? I mean, Fitz, you got you're on a training regimen, you're doing all these things, you have someone you're training with, you have an accountability partner, which I think in a lot of ways off-season workouts are an accountability partner. How much more likely is it that guys aren't in the right amount of shape? They're either not in shape or they're not in football shape, which those are two different things. They're pulling hamstrings more often. They're coming back at the wrong weight. Is that more likely if they switch it?
I think this also comes back to something Marshall talked a lot about realizing at one point in his career that he'd just become a professional, basically like for hire, like a gunner, right? He's just coming in and doing his thing. He talked about Belichick signing him on a Wednesday, starting him on a Sunday. He realized once he reached that point in his career that he always had to be in shape. So if he was always going to be in shape, he wasn't going to come into camp until July, August, if he could avoid it. I talked to one player that said he really never got that discipline. Like the offseason, just always, his body hurt so much at the end of the year. He didn't want anything to do with it. And it took so long before he felt good. He didn't want to get there. So like that is really guy to guy. But Jori, I think your point's a good one. And Frank, like we do have to keep in mind that when you're not at the facility, yes, they're still world-class athletes, but every single guy I talked to talked about, I want time with my family. I want to be able to reconnect in ways I couldn't during the season. I want to actually see my kids. Like those all are real things, but that can at times take away from the professional aspect. So yeah, are we going to lose? Like these are the injury things that the NFL, Frank, can have no idea until they implement it.
Right. And I think it is a little bit just person by person. Some guys are going to be super motivated to be in shape all year round. Austin Eckler, who does a lot of work with Matt Harmon over on our fantasy podcast, he's the kind of guy who would show up in tip-top shape no matter what day you start training camp. Whereas I'll go cross sport on you. Way back in the day, I covered the Milwaukee Bucks a little bit. And they had a lockout the year Robert Traylor was drafted. Robert Traylor, the big man from Michigan, rest in peace to him. And Robert Traylor came into camp so out of shape, they couldn't play him for more than a few minutes at a time. He just didn't have that discipline to stay in shape. We're in there, this lockout, and he's a rookie, and he doesn't really understand what it's like to be a professional yet. And it honestly maybe derailed his whole career because he got off to such a bad start. That will happen to guys in the NFL if you don't have any kind of disciplinary structure of, hey, you have to come to OTAs to get in shape. Some guys will show up out of shape in July. But you can't account for everything. Like these players want May, June, July off to be with their families. Yes, some guys are going to show up out of shape. You can't change the entire OTA structure and what you want and all that kind of stuff for the few who aren't going to have that discipline.
It is only funny when you mention that because I'll tell this story knowing that my buddy doesn't listen to this podcast because he doesn't like football. When I was with the band, our busiest year, we were gone 300 days. We played 200 and something shows. And when you play that many shows, you start to develop really bad tendonitis. Like there's a lot of arm issues and everything that you have. What was hysterical to me is we took a like the end of the year break. So it was like 3 weeks, a month before we went into rehearsals. When we came into rehearsals, you could tell my guy Love him to death. It was one of my best friends. He had not touched a drum set in that entire month. And the first day, everything he was playing was just god awful. And I'd look over and I'd be like, what is going on with you? And he's like, haven't touched a kit in a month, right? Like, but everybody needs different things. Like, that was his way of resetting. Like, for me, I couldn't take that much time off and still trust it. And that's for musicians. I can't imagine for athletes. Okay. We're going to move on to some expectation conversation, because this time of year, we got nothing to talk about other than what we think is going to happen this fall. So we thought it'd be fun to take a look at some teams, coaches, fan bases, whatever we want, that I think maybe have their expectations out of whack. Now, I want to caveat here. If you've been listening for the last month, you've already heard me rail about the Chargers and the Cowboys. So I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to repeat myself that everybody's wrong about the Chargers and the Cowboys at all. Go back and listen to old episodes. I will not do that. But we're each going to pick some things we think that are just out of whack. Jori is our esteemed guest, as our valued coworker, as the beacon of light in a dark, dark world on this show, the intelligence we need. Give us somebody, good or bad. Give us a team, fan base, whatever, something that you think is out of whack coming into this season.
Yeah, I think that expectations for the Pittsburgh Steelers are out of whack. And here's why. It's not whether people think they are going to be better or worse than what they are. It's what people think the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to succeed or fail on the basis of, that I think is totally out of whack. I think everyone is very excited about Russell Wilson and Justin Fields in the building. And I agree that is the best storyline. Like, we're writers. We need narratives that people care about. Both quarterbacks are trying to resurrect their careers. Both quarterbacks left their teams in pretty unusual circumstances. $85 million in dead cap hit for the Broncos and Russell Wilson. And then you've got Justin Fields, who left when there was this sort of back and forth last year. Will he be the guy? No, they have the first overall pick, which, by the way, the likelihood of that pick being the first overall when they made the trade a year prior, pretty low. And the Bears got Caleb Williams. And so I think that creates a really interesting question at quarterback for Pittsburgh. But I still think that the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to succeed or fail on the basis of their defense. That's what they've done for a lot of years. That's what Mike Tomlin's style has been. They got Patrick Queen at linebacker this year, which I thought was a great pickup. I mean, to pick him up in free agency, not only do you now get to use him to stabilize your defense, you also don't have to worry about him twice a year stopping Najee Harris and the rest of your run game like he was doing when he was with the Ravens. And I think that Mike Tomlin's consistent above 500 record has not been primarily because of that offense. Yes, there's the Ben Roethlisberger days, and they had a period where their offense has been good. But in recent years, when he has not lost, even with teams that feel far under the radar, it's because of that defense. What do you guys think?
I'm very torn on the Steelers in that I don't think their quarterback situation is any worse, and they made the playoffs last year, but yet I look at that division and I'm like, how are you going to compete with Joe Burrow, with Lamar Jackson, when you don't have
with the
really
defenses to stop them?
The other teams have defenses too. The Browns, the Ravens, even the Bengals might bounce back. They were really bad in defense last year, but I just don't know I have no idea what to make of the Steelers. I really don't. I don't know if Russ is absolutely washed. I don't know if I've already said I think Justin Fields is going to end up starting sooner rather than later, because I just don't know what Russ has, but I don't know what Justin Fields has either. The Steelers are one of those teams that just flummoxes me, but yet we're talking about expectations. Their fan base expects it's not good enough to just finish 500. They're tired of this whole Mike Tomlin just finishes 500 and we all celebrate it. They're like, we should be Super Bowl contenders. We're not winning championships. Well, I hate to tell you, you're really not close to a championship now either. And part of that's a quarterback situation. Like you said, this team will be as good as their defense and running game kind of takes them. I mean, they don't even have the receivers anymore. After trading Deontay, Claypool didn't work out. They're really thin there. But how far does that take you? Okay, maybe you sneak into the 7 seed again, but I don't know. I'm very torn about what to think of the Steelers right now.
Frank, it's funny you say that, because when you're saying, I hate to tell you, but you're not close to a championship. I had a friend who was looking for a therapist in the last year. She was like, I need a mean therapist. I don't want someone who's going to encourage me. I need someone who's going to tell me what I'm doing wrong, tell me the lifestyle problems I have and who's going to fix it. And I was just thinking when you were saying that, you would be the main therapist in the best base. Way. Yeah, you're I have your best interest in mind and I'm going to tell you that's the truth. And you are not close to a championship.
Yeah. By the way, I love my mean therapist. I like that I can just wax on about something and he looks at me, he's like, so what? And it's like, well, I thought it was a big deal. I like a little tough love. Here's the thing with the Steelers, because Jori, I think you raised a really interesting point. But one thing Frank and I said last year on the show about the Bills, at one point it looked like the Bills' offensive game plan was to roll the ball out and just absolutely pray to God that somehow, some way, Josh Allen could manufacture touchdowns. That was their offense week in and week out. I feel like that's what we do with the Steelers. Like, we're just rolling the ball out and being like, I don't know, Tomlin will figure it out. Like, if you just look, if I was just playing Madden, I'm playing the video game version of these, I would argue that the Steelers are the worst team in their division. And I would argue even in a world where I don't love Deshaun Watson, I still think they have the worst quarterback situation in the division. I think Russ is absolutely cooked, and I think they've created a controversy that doesn't need to exist while they try and figure out who Justin Fields is in this offense. So I think the Steelers take a step back. I think the expectations are out of whack because we just expect that, glory, hallelujah, somehow the football savior known as Mike Tomlin can turn water into wine. He can turn this BS team into something that deserves to be part of the playoffs. I don't think it can happen. So I'm with you that it's out of whack. That's it, to me. Now watch Tomlin turn around and have a winning season, and I'll take it all back. I'm still wishing the Steelers had fired him so that somebody else could have hired him that would appreciate him. All right, Frank, give me something that to you is way out of whack coming into this season.
I hate to say this because it's got a really good percentage chance to be wrong, but I wonder, we've discussed it a little bit, are we a little too excited about Jordan Love? I think we need to put that out there, that through half of last season, the general manager was up in a press conference saying, hey, this is a Big Ten games for Jordan Love. We don't know what we have. And over the second half of the season, Jordan Love was great. There's nothing I could look at on tape and say, well, this is why Jordan Love's going to fall apart. But it's a half a season. And we overrate playoff performances too. He's great against the Cowboys, right? And that win is
interesting that you think okay. Continue. Sorry.
No, go ahead. What were you gonna say? Because I'll riff
interesting
off
that you think we overrate playoff performances. Because I was going to say the opposite, which is that sometimes I think we give people too much credit because they're winning the games against the teams that don't matter, not winning the games against teams that do, and against opponents that they actually need to get past if they want to go somewhere. And so to me, and again, maybe this is just my bias having covered the Cowboys and seeing their inability to get past those teams. But when someone can actually do it, I'm like, oh, that says something not only for their ability, but also for what their teammates believe they can do.
No, and that is a great point. I think my angle on that is always, it's a one-game situation. And the gambler in me probably looks at it as probabilities, right? Like, Jordan Love isn't going to ball out 10 times out of 10 against the Cowboys and the Packers beat them. He had a great day. They won. And all of a sudden he vaults from a guy who we like to a guy who we, pun intended, love. And now all of a sudden we think he's the next Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers. Well, is he? Again, he was awesome in the second half. He's set up for success, but we've vaulted him to, oh, he's just the Packers' next great quarterback. I don't know if he's there yet just because of a half season. I need to see it again. I need to see him repeat it. More likely than not, I think he's a good quarterback. But I just wonder if the expectations are a little too heavy based on really what amounts to a half season and a good playoff run, a very good playoff run. Is he there yet? I'm not quite sure I'm there with Jordan Love.
Yeah, I think you make the good point that just because he played really well doesn't mean he's going to be great. And I think it is also very interesting to consider, like, I have the same question with CJ Stroud, that CJ Stroud was fantastic last year. I think he'll be really good again this year, but then is he going to be really good and not have the defenses having figured him out? Or are the Mike McDonalds of the world that had all offseason to figure out what they want to do against him going to, like, a little bit put him in his place, but then he'll overcome that and be great again too? And I think that the Packers and Jordan Love will go through some of those pains.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, one thing that I try to do is apply the same benefit of the doubt across the board. And I don't know that we would give this much benefit of the doubt to a quarterback that essentially had half a season. And it is interesting to me, as Frank and I have mentioned before, how we just forget that Monday night game against the Raiders that was atrocious. We let some of those moments go away because it got so good. But I think there is a fine line here somewhere because, again, Jordan Love has had this moment to get his rust off and start to really show who he is. But also, everybody in that division has had all summer. They will have had all summer to just break down everything Jordan Love does and implement whatever they think is going to confuse Jordan Love. So, that's why I'm such a believer, and nobody in the world lets this happen, but I love a 3-year book of on any quarterback. I want to see year 1 of their success, year 2 of the adjustment teams make to them, and then year 3 is when it all normalizes. Now we get an idea of who they both are. We're not letting Jordan Love even get to a full completed season before we've decided that he should be anointed. So I like that. You guys have both gone with expectations that are too high. I was going to do the same thing, but I feel like we need some polypositive in my life. So can I hit you with one off the top of my head that I feel like for the second straight year, I'm going to give you a team that everybody's giving up on that I just don't understand, and it's the Buffalo Bills. I think the expectations are wildly out of whack for the AFC East. Everybody wants to come in. I'll just make it the AFC East as a whole here, because all of a sudden we're saying, well, the Jets are going to win the division, which presumes that Aaron Rodgers is going to be healthy, make it through a full season. Their tackles are really going to be able to maintain their health, especially at their age. Also, you're presuming that Tua is going to stay healthy, which is a bit of an interesting presumption, and that the Dolphins aren't just a book of cards, a house of cards that have beaten a bunch of bad teams, also a presumption. And then you're presuming that everything's going to go wrong for the Bills. And one thing Damian Harris said to us over and over and over again on the Yahoo Draft Show was that the Bills internally believe that the net number of touchdowns that Josh Allen will account for every year is the same with or without Stephon Diggs. That's why they were comfortable letting him walk. They don't believe that a huge wide receiver makes a difference in that offense with that player. Why not at least let it prove out? Josh Allen has been Superman over and over again. Last year, I heard the Bills were going to suck, and all they did was, as I said they would, win the last, 5-6 games of the year. They end up getting home field in the playoffs. Weren't able to take advantage of it, but they end up getting there. If we're talking about the regular season of the Bills, I think the death of the Bills is wildly over-reported. It's overreactionary. We are out of whack with where we think the Bills are going to be, Frank.
You might be right. I fall victim to this too. You want the next shiny thing. We discussed how much I like the Jets coming into this year. Maybe I'm falling for that narrative. But you make good points of the Bills. I just wonder, look, we saw this with Tom Brady. He was obviously great throughout his whole career, but when he didn't have the weapons around him, when Rashae Caldwell was his number one guy, Jabbar Gaffney was his number two guy, he wasn't as great. Who the heck is Josh Allen throwing the ball to? We're expecting Keon Coleman to be like a number one guy right away, or Curtis Samuel to be something he's never been. I agree. Josh Allen's awesome. He's going to be good no matter who's around him, but we're talking about, can the Bills be great? Because good, they've been good. Bills fans are sick of good. They want, let's actually get to the bowl. Let's do something. I don't know that they have that in them this year, especially. But you are probably right that they've been a little discounted because, now they don't have Stephon Diggs. They keep losing in the playoffs. They had a weird season last year, obviously. Maybe we are pouring dirt on their graves a little prematurely. I could be just as guilty of this as anybody because I'm not very high on them coming into the year. But at some point, you need help. And I don't know who is helping Josh Allen really be great this season.
I think that my concern with the Bills is also just that they lost a lot of players. They lost key guys on their defense in free agency. And so I think that for me, the out of whack expectations would be that they would be struggling all year. But I think the reasonable expectations is that they will struggle at the beginning of the year until they figure out how to build around their new pieces, get chemistry around those new pieces, both Josh Allen in an offense without Stephon Diggs and the defense without some of their key anchors. But we've seen so many times that the Bills have been able to sort of backs against the wall, embrace that mentality. And I know that's so overused in the NFL, but when they did it last year and won 6 of their last 7 regular season games, I think that's what they showed, and they can do that again.
By the way, I left the Patriots out of my AFC East discourse there out of whack. Patriots are going to be awful. Just FYI, the Patriots are going to be awful.
Okay, I saw you put them on the outline, and I thought you were going to defend them, that they were going to be better, and I was curious.
No, I think the Patriots
teeing off on that.
I think the Patriots have a very good shot at the number 1 overall pick in the draft next year. There is no proof of concept that their head coach is ready. We have no idea. Replacing a legend is wildly difficult to do. You're bringing in a rookie quarterback that you hope can adjust, but in the meantime, the reason that they were picking that high is in part because the roster was deficient in many ways. The presumption is that defense is going to continue winning them games, but do we really know that at this point, especially in that division? I think the Patriots are headed for a 4-win season max. It feels like, I'm not saying the Patriots won't be fine over time. We just have right now, benefit of the doubt. They don't even have anybody I can look at, Jori, and say, yeah, that's the guy they're banking on.
Well, since you have so many thoughts, I want to know, how many games do you think Drake May is starting, and how many games do you think Jacoby Brissett is starting? Because if they're that bad, I really hope they are keeping Jacoby out there and not wrecking Drake's beginning of his career.
No, I could see Drake playing the whole season. They're gonna fall in love with Drake in training camp, and then it's just gonna be a disaster. It's gonna be a disaster.
I think Brissett starts half the year. I really do. I think he's good enough that I don't know. Maybe look, Jordan Mayo's a first-time head coach. He doesn't want to take a 4-13 that type of season. Maybe he gets impatient, but I do think that this organization really realizes Jacoby's good enough. let's not ruin Drake May. Let's let him sit a bit. Maybe some guys develop. Maybe they get better. Jalen Polk or whoever emerges as a good receiver for him. Their offensive line comes together. I could see them sitting him for a while. And I'm usually not like that with rookie quarterbacks. I think that most top 10 guys play pretty soon. But I think Drake May might sit a while. Just because Brissett, there's a reason. I think there's a reason I got Brissett.
The most revealing part of this conversation, Fitz, is that you think the Carolina Panthers are going to win at least 4 games and arguably probably more based off this calculus. So what do you have in store for Bryce Young?
I'm just saying Bryce at this point, look, Bryce is better than last year showed. They did spend $100 million plus to try and help the offensive line, which is something that he desperately needed. And they brought in veterans at the offensive line, which I think is also something he needed. The one knock I heard on Bryce coming out of the draft that I thought was an important one from some people that knew the Alabama program well was that he at times had a hard time communicating some of the defensive looks to his offensive line. That's part of the reason he was under so much duress in Alabama. Didn't always work for him. I think we saw some of that in his rookie year. I think bringing veteran offensive linemen in will actually help his development, not only keeping him upright, but also helping some of that communication. I think Bryce takes a cute little step forward this year. It's a cute little step. He's not going to be CJ, but he takes a cute little step.
I can see it. I can see it. But the Panthers are going to be bad. I know some people out there are like starting to get high on the Panthers. They're going to be that roster is
4 or 5
really
wins.
not good.
They'll be
really
4 or 5. Like they're going to be in contention for that top pick. But I'm going to give it right now to the Patriots. Okay, we've got a bunch more to get to with expectations, but also because we like to be positive around here, we're each going to pick a team that didn't make the playoff last year that we think could be in that playoff run this year. And one of them, I'm just saying, cough, Jori, is absolutely stunning, shocking, surprising. Oh my God. We'll do that when we come back. All right, more expectations to go. We've had a minute to think about our next expectation pick. Jori, you get to go here. A team whose expectations, a player, a coach, anything that are way out of whack. What do you got?
Okay. Turns out I actually misunderstood the prompt on the third one, so we'll get back to that. But I would say expectations out of whack for this year. The Browns, I think that the problem is the Browns are so good on defense. They have so many skill players, but I still think that if we are relying on Deshaun Watson to come back to what he was, I mean, someone actually compared him. Oh, no, it was C-Rob who compared him to Odell Beckham Jr. And it's sort of this idea of like when you peak at the beginning of your career and then you never get back to it. Like what quarterback have we seen who just had several down years, some of them completely out of football, also off-field challenges, and then all of a sudden turned around? Now, you could say that the Browns are going to be good in spite of Deshaun Watson, and I do think they're going to be good, and I do think they should still be playoff contenders, but I think that there are definitely people who believe they should be Super Bowl contenders, and to me, until you give me proof that Deshaun Watson is going to be able to play even 70% of what he used to, because I don't think we've seen that he can stay healthy, which I also think he probably increases injury risk when he took that time off. I have trouble believing that they're going to get over the hump, especially in a difficult division like they're in.
It's me. I am the person who thinks the Browns are Super Bowl contenders because I keep.
Oh yeah,
I keep coming back.
I've been listening to this shit.
I keep coming back to this thought that can Deshaun Watson be as good as Joe Flacco off of his couch on Thanksgiving? Yes. And if he's just as good as Joe Flacco was coming off of his, we saw like this whole Joe Flacco story was really, really cool, right? Like he was not doing anything. He plays really well. But in 2022, Joe Flacco was terrible. And I think he just was in a situation in Cleveland last year that was so good he couldn't fail. He played well, give him credit, all that kind of stuff. I think Deshaun Watson could be at least as good as that. I keep bringing this up and I hate doing it because I hate quarterback wins as a stat, but the Browns went 5-1 in his starts last year. There's some noise in that. I get that. He missed most of one of those games with injury, blah, blah, blah. But he played at a level where if he's just that guy who's a below average quarterback, the Browns can be really, really good. And if he's middle of the road, even if he gets back up to that 12 to 14 type of ranking as far as quarterbacks go, the Browns could be awesome. And I think I don't like rooting for Deshaun Watson for a million reasons we've talked about for the past few years, but I think he can get back to that level of being a good quarterback, not necessarily great like he was in Houston for a while, but good. And if he's good, the Browns are going to be really, really tough to beat.
I mean, the Browns won 11 games last year. And I forget that sometimes. I only say that because I legitimately forget. They were 11-6 last year. This is a talented football team.
And they had some games where they were drawing absolutely dead. Like Dorian Thompson-Robinson was starting some games. Like, they still won 11. So I'm like, how could they be worse? Although I know the defense is usually sticky and all this kind of stuff. But I'm really, really high on the Browns. I think the Browns could be awesome this year.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because either way, what this show is going to show us, like this, that we're all on different sides of the Browns here. But the one thing we know is that if it doesn't work, then by the end of the year, the rumble becomes a roar, right? Like I asked when Deshaun Watson was acquired. The question I asked at the time on the radio shows I was doing was, what level of success to fans that are uncomfortable with this acquisition will allow you to forgive the acquisition for whatever anybody thinks on the off the field stuff? And the answer I got from callers and Twitter X at the time was they got to win a Super Bowl, which is disgusting to think that a Super Bowl is enough to make you forget everything. That's a whole nother conversation. But I only say that because I think there are a whole group of Browns fans that are like, look, I don't want to root for this human, but I got to root for this quarterback because he's the quarterback of my favorite team. So now I got to see my favorite team win. That's going to turn violently from those fans. Like there's going to be a level of absolute viciousness from Browns fans if Deshaun Watson can't get rid of the yips. But what if he has the yips? What if he's just now a shell of himself as a quarterback? Like, I think it's one of the most interesting storylines going into the season, because if Deshaun Watson finds even a shell of who he's been at his best, this is a Super Bowl team. And if he doesn't, then this is arguably the worst acquisition we've ever seen in NFL history, and no one's ever going to forgive it. Like, I don't remember seeing something this all or nothing, and I think this is truly the all or nothing year for the Browns.
Yeah. Oh, you're definitely right. Like if Deshaun Watson takes them to a Super Bowl, like we look at this trade totally different, right? Like all of a sudden it's not the worst trade in NFL history. And that's kind of what's at stake for the Browns. If they miss the playoffs this year, and they could, certainly, their over-under is 8.5, I believe. They're in the toughest division of football if it's not the NFC North. If they miss the playoffs, we're probably like, whatever, Russell Wilson trade, Herschel Walker trade, we don't care. Deshaun Watson trade was the worst in NFL history. Those are the stakes for the Browns this year, and I don't think there's any question about that.
All right, Frank, give us your next expectations out of whack thought.
Yeah, and Jori mentioned this guy. I'll loop in the team. It's CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans. I love CJ Stroud. I was blown away by his rookie year. I've never seen anything like it. I am president of the fan club right now, but I also do have to take a step back and say, is there a plexiglass principle involved here? And let me explain that real quick. I think it's a baseball thing. So I'm going to go a little bit of NBA today, a little bit of MLB too. It's that time of year, right? We should be talking about other sports. And in baseball, the analytics basically say, if you improve a ton one year, you're very, very unlikely to improve again. You're going to bounce back a little bit. You're going to hit the plexiglass and your ceiling's going to bounce back. I think that's an old Bill James thing. If I'm totally getting this wrong, somebody smart will tell me about it, but it makes sense. The Houston Texans improved so much last year that it's almost impossible for them to improve again. Improvement isn't always linear. Sometimes you take a little bit of a step back. There's a reason the term sophomore slump exists. I love CJ Stroud. There's no reason, like Jordan Love talked about him before. There's no reason watching tape or anything like that to say CJ Stroud is going to, he's going to regress because of this or that. No, he was really, really good. He might be MVP this year for all we know, but our expectations are that he's going to get better. Our expectations are, well, CJ Stroud just had the greatest rookie season of all time for a quarterback, arguably. I think he did. He's going to be an MVP candidate this year. It doesn't always work like that. And I wonder if we're too out in front of our skis with the Texans as a team, with CJ Stroud as a quarterback. And I also wonder if the Colts are lingering. I'll be honest with you. By the time it comes down to making predictions, which we do late August and early September, I might pick the Colts to win that division. I just wonder, again, if we're just a little too ahead of ourselves with the Texans and just believing, oh, their step last year was so far forward, they got to take another step like that. It doesn't always work like that.
It's interesting you say that to me, only because I think you could argue also that the CJ Stroud expectations will put the entire rookie class quarterback expectations out of whack. Like,
yes, I've heard a ton this year already.
I feel like he made all of their lives so much harder.
Mm-hmm, and think about the fact that Trevor Lawrence is no longer a sure thing for the Jags. That's how off the rails it can go. And that's been our context of late. And now our context is, well, you better have the best. Like, if Caleb Williams doesn't have the greatest rookie passing season of all time, which is what CJ Stroud was last year, then people will be like, he's a bum. CJ Stroud was better. Like, that's wild in the way that it has changed expectations, Story.
Yeah, I will say, even though I know I talked about this earlier with guys having the defensive coordinators have all this time to get ready for CJ Stroud. I will also say, I think that Houston staff is so good that if there is a group that can combat that and can overcome that, I do think it's the Houston Texans. And so for me, this is more about, like, I know there are teams that say the first 30% of the season is unscouted looks, or 30%. This is what it is. At the beginning of the season, 30% of the defenses you see are unscouted looks. Like, you're not expecting them based off of last year. And so I think that that will be a challenge in the first few weeks of the season for them, especially because they're going to be on primetime, 6 times now when they were 0 times last year. Like, the stakes are going to be higher. But I actually do think the combination of CJ Stroud, his quarterback's coach, Gerard Johnson, who I really believe in, Bobby Slowick, their offensive coordinator. Oh, by the way, in addition to Nico and Tank, they now have Stephon Diggs. And so their offense can look different because they have a different passing game assortment of weapons. I actually think they're going to be just fine. It is just that the expectations are probably unrealistically high when they should be high. And also, again, it takes time for people in this season.
Yeah, I think, by the way, you can just be out of whack by being normal with your expectations. You know what I mean? Like, that's the funny part about it. The expectations for CJ will no longer allow that. I'll give you an expectation thought here. I'm going to go a little off the side here, but I almost think we forget sometimes that the Seahawks are going through a complete rebrand of who they are. And so for me, the expectations constantly that we seem to have as a society is that the Seahawks are always going to be competitive. They're always going to be right in this. But Mike Macdonald, the new head coach, came over from Baltimore. And it's stuck in my head that last year Ravens players were talking about the fact that it took a couple of years to really understand what that defense was about. So now you have a defensive coordinator that's going over to Seattle to take over a team that needs that time to figure out what the defense is really all about. And at the same time, I don't think that they have a sure thing, honest answer at the quarterback position that everybody really understands. And we have no idea what the offensive identity is truly going to look like. So to me, it wouldn't be a surprise at all. Like, just the expectation that the Seahawks are going to be competitive this year feels like unreached to me. To me, the Seahawks are in the spot. And I think Frank will agree that I say this about most new coaches. First-year head coaches come in and they start a gut. And when you start gutting things, more often than not, it gets into something difficult, especially if your schemes are complicated. Mike Macdonald's schemes are complicated. So I think it's reasonable to expect the Seahawks to take a fairly drastic step back before they can rebuild that. I don't think they're going to be in bad hands long-term. But to me, the Seahawks seem like they're I haven't one by one their schedule, but they seem to me like a 6-win team this year. And I think that's far different than where the expectation comes in for them.
And I'm completely opposite on you. I think that Seattle could be really good this year. I think Mike Macdonald could be one of those first-year coaches who we're talking about, like Brian Daboll with the Giants winning Coach of the Year, or Jason Garrett back in the day did win Coach of the Year. Matt Nagy won Coach of the Year. First-year guys, because I think the talent is there for Seattle. They really underachieved last year. And I do agree with you on Macdonald's schemes being very complicated. If you read about what he did with the Ravens, they run a lot of the same things out of completely different looks, and you need your players to be used to that. They need to know, okay, we're running this out of this look. We've done this before out of that look. We get it. We're veterans. We can do that. So you're right. It might take an adjustment period, but I just look at that team and there's just a talent everywhere at receiver position. Geno was good 2 years ago. He regressed last year. I get that, but he's still got the talent. Their offensive line isn't as bad as everybody thinks it is, and they do have talent on defense. I think Macdonald could get the most out of. So I think Macdonald could be, look, as I'm sitting here talking through it, Fitz, I might have to go make a Coach of the Year bet, because Mike Macdonald checks all the boxes of guys who just get votes for Coach of the Year. He's a rookie head coach. Everybody's going to say, wow, look at how he improved the Seahawks, where in reality, they just kind of underachieved last year. I think this team could be a playoff team in a weak NFC. I really like the Seahawks coming into this year. I don't think there's much expectations for them at all, really, coming into this year after they kind of did a face plant last year.
Frank, sorry, Jordan, to jump in here, but doesn't that at some level sort of, I don't want to say disrespect because that's not your intent, doesn't that downplay the impact Pete Carroll had? Like, most of us believe Pete still has his fastball. So one of the best coaches in the NFL, supposedly, that's out there kicking ass every week, supposedly walks away. Like Mike Macdonald, I should say. We need too many of these Mikes in the league. Mike Macdonald coming in.
So many Mikes. Every head coach is named Mike and every GM is named Joe. I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I hope we one day do a full podcast on it. But also, I think that when you look at Mike Macdonald and how complicated his scheme is, I think the big thing is that I had someone tell me that he's like the Shanahan on defense in terms of scheme. And so I go back and look, well, how did Kyle Shanahan do when he first got to the Niners? And like those first couple of seasons were 6-10, 4-12, but he also didn't really have a quarterback. And so I think I'm less concerned about, does he have the ability to teach in a way that guys can pick up his principles, and more, does he have the players and the personnel in year one that he's going to want to carry out his scheme? But I think that people will be able to pick it up. I also think with Pete Carroll, even if Pete Carroll is one of the best coaches and has a Super Bowl and was really successful at the college level, guys' success level at the end of a tenure with an organization is often different. It doesn't necessarily mean that they objectively lost their fastball, but the impact of that fastball and the impact of it to resonate at the end of a tenure in an organization that he'd been there so long, I think that there's not something you have to consider the context.
Yeah, and I honestly just think Pete had a bad year. And he did. I think even Pete would probably say that. I like Pete Carroll. I think he had a heck of an NFL career if he doesn't coach again. But I just think last year wasn't his year for reasons maybe out of his control. But that team underachieved. And I think Mike Macdonald, just like Jori kind of alluded to, just gives a fresh voice in there. And he's very, very well respected around the league. He was very well respected by his Ravens players. I think that he can rejuvenate them a little bit. Not necessarily that Pete's bad. I think Pete, I was actually really, really surprised he was fired. I like Pete. I respect Pete. I just think he had a bad year, and I think Mike Macdonald, the hiring, if they could pick up that scheme quickly enough, and I think he's a smart enough guy to kind of adjust a little bit and simplify it to get these guys on the same page year one, I think they could really take off. I think this could be a really surprising team, actually.
Yeah, by the way, every time you say loss of voice and then anything with Michael McDonald just makes me want to go full Doobie Brothers. Like, we need to get like a Doobie Brothers drop here, like woo, 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 like coming in. And Jori, Google it. Michael McDonald's the singer.
Yeah, if I hear Jamo be there one more time.
Yeah. I'm gonna be there. Oh, right.
That's old McDonald?
Okay. This is, look, Frank, what we need to dedicate, I'll tell you what, Jori, we'll dedicate a whole podcast to your
pop culture.
Mike and Joe.
Mike and Joe's. If you'll then just indulge us with a whole podcast full of music and pop culture references, that we'll just give it to you, and then we'll drop it in the show, and then we'll explain it, and then we'll see if you can use it back in a sentence. And this could be a whole culturalization of Jori.
I feel like it would be way more entertaining for our listeners if we were to say, like, you give me a reference, you're like, what do you think that is? Since I won't know what anything is.
You will have no
like
clue,
those things are always so, like, I am the pop culture equivalent of what the Tennessee Titans do with their logos every year on schedule release. It's no clue what's going on here.
This is a new game at the end of every episode that Jori's a guest on. From now on, we'll put it in the doc.
What is this movie about?
We'll give you a quote and then a multiple choice if you can figure out where it's from or what it's about. This is gonna be a delight. We'll add it to the doc. More work for
I'm
you.
Glad I have value.
Oh God, so much. All right, we've done a lot of out of whack expectations, especially for teams that might be thinking too much. But as we end it, because we like to end on a happy note, ta-da! I figure why not give everybody one non-playoff team from last year that you feel good about going into this year. And, here I was as we went into the commercial saying Jori had a shocking pick, but it was really Frank that had a shocking pick here. So, and then Jori didn't understand the assignment. So I've really blown the whole episode at this point. So now we're just going to give you very non-shocking picks of a team. So Jori, again, is our guest. You may go first. One non-playoff team from last year that you think this year could be a playoff team.
Okay, so I briefly misunderstood the assignment and picked a team that I thought was not going to make the playoffs this year. But then, because I was like, I need to take accountability, I decided to take a look and think, do I actually think the Los Angeles Chargers are going to make the playoffs this year? And while I have a lot of questions about the Chargers' ability to, one, overcome the football gods, two, get the Jim Harbaugh magic working already in year one, three, actually have pieces around Justin Herbert that allow him to play to his potential. When you look at their schedule, it's actually not that bad. You get 2 games against the Raiders, who don't have a quarterback. You get 2 games against the Denver Broncos, who don't have a quarterback, except for that Sean Payton thinks they have a quarterback. And then you're also playing the Panthers. You're playing the Cardinals, the Saints, the Titans, the Buccaneers, the Patriots. I mean, we talked about how bad we think the Patriots are going to be. Like, when I went through, I was like, I can see them getting to 10 wins and getting a wild card spot. So while I still have a lot of questions about their ability to advance and definitely don't think they're winning a playoff game, I do think that their schedule is set up playing the Patriots and Panthers type teams in addition to a division that, like, even if they don't pull one over on Mahomes, which you never know, you could, like, crazy things happen when you have a rivalry in a division, I actually think their schedule is pretty favorable.
That's really interesting. And maybe we were talking about Mike Macdonald. maybe I've got the wrong first-year coach who ends up being coach of the year. I think Jim Harbaugh is actually the favorite in the betting odds. I might be wrong about that. But I've gone the other way on the Chargers and feeling like Fitz talked about this is a gut year. Jim Harbaugh needs to get his guys in there. He needs to run his scheme. He needs to really shape the Chargers in the way he wants them to be. But you might be right, Jory. You're right. They have a lot of winnable games, and confidence is a funny thing in the NFL. And if you get that thing cooking early, yeah, they could end up being in playoff contention. It's a really, really interesting team.
Now, I got them at 6 wins. I don't think they're going to be a very good team this year. But I do think long-term, the Chargers are going to be a juggernaut. I just think it takes a couple of years to get your guys.
Okay,
juggernaut.
Wow. The Chargers are existentially incapable of being a juggernaut, Fitz, and you know that.
Well, I mean, I think they'll be really good. We'll say that. Like, the Chargers are going to be really good for the next several years. They got a quarterback. They got a coach. That's a hefty combo in the NFL. Frank, give us one non-playoff team for you.
I've talked about a couple already this offseason. The Bears, I think, are kind of everybody's choice, right? I obviously like the Jets. I have a wager with a certain person who might play fiddle on the side that they're going to win a playoff game. So I kind of got to stick with that. But I wanted to go really, really far out there. Do you want to add
any bets to that?
No, I really want no bets. No more bets, as they say at the roulette table. Jory, you wouldn't know about that, but me and Fitz do. We get that. The team, look, every year, and last year was the Texans, we see a team come out of absolutely nowhere to make the playoffs, makes a huge jump. So this sounds crazy, but I'm in the middle of doing all my previews. I'm doing the bad teams right now because we count them down from 32-1. And one team that stuck out to me of, maybe this team is going to be really good. Don't laugh. It's the Washington Commanders. I think the Commanders absolutely positively transformed their franchise this offseason. We talk about new coach, a new GM who everybody wanted, a new quarterback, obviously, at number 2. And if I'm not putting in the whole, maybe he's CJ Stroud because he's the number 2 pick. But if you think about a lot of the rookies who have had instant success, RG3, Lamar Jackson, a lot of these guys, look, passing the ball in an NFL environment is pretty hard, but the athleticism is never going to leave you. I've seen Jaden Daniels be really, really good running the ball and make plays that way. The Commanders had the highest roster turnover of any team in the NFL this year. They added a ton in free agency because they had all this cap space. I think they added a lot of guys who Adam Peters and Dan Quinn wanted to bring in to kind of shape this team. Look, it's going to be difficult. They're in a difficult division. But when I look at the NFC as a whole, where are your wildcard teams coming from? This is not a very deep conference. So I think the Commanders could be that one team who we're sitting here in 6 months or whenever it is saying, whoa, this team came out of nowhere, when in fact the hints are there. We just got to look really, really close. We got to squint a little bit, but I think the Commanders might be in the playoff race this year.
That's a stunning pick. I love it. It's a stunning pick. I never would have thought of it. And
so, look, Frank, who do you think from the NFC East is making the playoffs if the Commanders make it?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, can you get 3 NFC East teams in? I'm not sure. I'm not positive. Look, the NFC North looks great on paper, but are the Packers or Bears going to step back a little bit? That could happen. I don't know who comes, but who's making it out of the South or the West? The champions, obviously.
Someone has to, I hear.
Someone almost one of those teams will, but I don't think there's a second team coming out of the South. If there's a second team coming out of the West, I guess the Rams, but the Rams just lost one of the 5 best players I've ever seen. Let's not overlook that. The Rams might take a step back. So I don't know if there's any wildcard teams coming out of there, which, one might bump to the NFC East. And I can tell you this, I think the Giants are terrible. The Giants are going to be really, really bad this year. So let's cross them off the list. I don't think the Vikings are going to do it. So if a team like maybe the Eagles just struggle because of this power, dynamic with their coaching staff. Maybe the Packers take a step back. Maybe the Bears defense holds them back and they have a rookie quarterback. I just think I'm not, look, do I think the Commanders are going to make the playoffs? At the end of the day, if you're giving me even odds, I'm not going to bet them, but I do think that they could be a surprise team and be right in the mix. And maybe you catch a break here or there. You don't catch many injuries. Maybe a team like that. If I would have been talking about the Texans like this 12 months ago, you guys would have laughed me off of the podcast. Right? So there's always a team like this. And the Commanders have a lot of things that you kind of say, this really makes a lot of sense for them to be the surprise team this year.
I love it. I'll give you, and in that spirit, look, the Bears are the easy answer here. And I'm already on the record saying I think the Bears make the playoffs. So I didn't want to put them in here. There are really two other teams. One of them is not a hot take. So I'll just quickly say, not only do I think the Bengals are going to make the playoffs, I think Cincinnati's going to end up with home field in the number 1 seed. I think they're going to be the best team in the AFC this year.
Above the Ravens, wow.
I'm taking Cincinnati. I'm taking a healthy Burrow and an offense that is going to be absolutely trying to push the ball at every opportunity. If Burrow stays healthy, number 1 pick. So I need a team that like not everybody's talking about. And I know there's been some controversy post-draft, but I still like Atlanta to come out of the South. As Jori said, somebody has to. And I don't love a quarterback that's 4,372 years old that has an Achilles injury. I don't. Whether we're talking about Aaron Rodgers or Kirk Cousins.
After 4,371, that's sort of like your threshold for Achilles
That's when you hit the wall. And then you're like, anything else, rotator cuff, I'm good there. But like, give me Achilles, I'm done with that. So like, I think there are reasonable concerns, but I cannot say this loud enough. All I think Atlanta needs is competent coaching to use their offensive weapons, and almost any quarterback can have some success there. So I think Kirk Cousins, presuming he can stay healthy enough, if they can get the ball out of his hands quickly, which in that offense I think they can, that's going to be their big sign for life. I hope they don't end up needing Michael Penix this year, because that would be a sign that this prediction has gone off the rails. But somebody has to win the division. The Buccaneers won it last year. Canales is gone. Was this a one-year wonder for Baker? Who knows? Did the Bucs take even a tiny step back? One game would make all the difference here. I don't trust New Orleans, and I think Carolina, while they might be better, are still not good. So all Atlanta has to do is win 9 games, and they get into the playoffs. So I like Atlanta a lot to find a way to sneak in the NFC with their quarterback acquisition.
Real quick, Fitz, and that's what I was going to ask you, because picking the NFC South champ is a little bit of a cop out because that division stinks. How many games do you think the Falcons win?
9. I think they feel like
9 and 8.
Like there's certain teams, and I keep saying like, look, I haven't gone week to week through the schedule because that's a much different process. I just look at teams and I'm like, that feels like a 6-win team. That feels like a 9-win team. Like Atlanta feels like a 9-win team.
9 wins. I just look at it. You're like moment of meditation.
We could sit here all day long and go through the week by week, but if we'd have done that last year, we would have counted the Texans as a win for everybody every week. Right. So sometimes the who's going to win what game gets maddening. It's like, it just feels like they're in the range of like, I think the Bengals are a 13-win team this year. I think they are going to be dominant all across the board.
I did not realize you were this high on the Bengals. Wow.
I am high on Joe Burrow.
I did this last year, and then the day after I left Bengals training camp, Joe got hurt again. The defense started to unravel all of that. So
it sounds like,
it
sounds like me and Fitz need to have a Bengals versus Browns. Who finishes better? We might need to figure that one out over the next few weeks, because I think the Browns, when you talk about the Bengals, that's why I feel about the Browns. So we'll see. We'll see in that division.
That's why. But I will say I'm high on the Browns too. Like I think the Bengals, Browns could both be, and the Ravens, all 3 of those teams are going to be. It's going to be absolutely fine. You know what, Frank? We'll wait till we have a shot and a drink to make those bets.
Shot and a drink.
Everything goes fine. Shot and a drink at the roulette table. Jori, that's how this show celebrates. Shot and a drink at the roulette table. So you just let me know when you're in, and
we don't go like run a mile together.
No.
Okay,
well. It depends. It's the shot and the drink at the roulette table at the end of the mile. Because
if you did, I might break Roger Bannister's 4-minute then. Like, let's go. Let's get it.
All right. I can promise you one thing. Jori will be back in a couple of weeks. And at that point, we're going to start pop culture quizzes at the end of shows to make sure, see how this thing goes. That's going to be a sensation for the summer. You can follow us all on social media at Jason Fitz, at Jori Epstein, at Yahoo Schwab, of course. Thanks, of course, Brett sitting in behind the scenes, doing a great job producing. We got one of the big bosses to come in and produce the show. So if it's extra spicy today, that's great. If it's only a 6-minute show, it means Brett thought most of it sucked and he just cut the rest of it out. In the meantime, rate, subscribe, review, do all of those things. Tell your friends, your family, your enemies. Tell everybody you've ever met in your life to hang out with us. We'll be back next week with more pods. Have fun. Have a great week. Thanks for listening, y'all.